Hello everyone, and welcome to the Quarks and Quarternotes podcast. My name is John Henry Johnson, and I'm a professional musician here with friend and student of physics, Tyler Haley. This series is the culmination of our discussions from the past decade on all of our favorite topics: science, music, and philosophy. In today's episode, we will be talking about the relationship between the worlds of science and music. So I think I'd like to start with the physics of sound, since music is made of sound. Do you think Tyler could give me a quick little overview of the physics?
Sure. So sound is propagating density waves through the air. And what that means is if you look at a region of air, as sound goes through it, all you will see is the density of it going up and down.
Yeah. Now you say air, but I know sound can travel through water and such. So is it medium?
Right. Sound can travel through any medium. And it has to have a medium to travel through.
So not say in a vacuum.
Right. Yeah. No sound travels through a vacuum. There has to be some particles there to transfer that energy.
Are you telling me Star Wars is not an accurate representation?
Unfortunately not. Not of sound.
So if I'm inside a spaceship and someone else is inside a spaceship and they blow up,
Right.
I don't hear anything.
Probably not. No, unless debris hit your ship or something.
And I would hear just like that ping.
You would just see an explosion and that's it. You're like watching a TV on mute. So for instance, if you just take a cube just in front of your face, 2 feet, a cube of air, and if you were to measure the density as a function of time, you would just see it going up and down very rapidly.
And whether you're hitting a drum or blowing a horn, it's the exact same process.
Exactly. Yeah, a vibrating string is pushing the air very rapidly. Yeah, there's many ways to get sound, and many types of sound, I guess you could say.
Now, when we talk about musical sounds, there's kind of a distinction to be made between melody and rhythm. You have rhythm repeating patterns at certain intervals, and then you have melody, which are certain groups of musical notes. But I guess fundamentally they're not different.
Right, so the difference between an A note, say, on a piano, and beating a drum 440 times a second, those are equivalent.
So the world record is 20 beats per second, so it would be quite challenging to play 400.
20 hertz, though, so 20 times per second would be 1 beat per second.
Right,
So that is still
very,
a note.
very low frequency note. Interesting. I think that's a really good way of showing how they are the same thing, because it really is just the difference of speed. But in the mind of the musician, it can be very different.
Well, you can look at it in terms of just the physics of the fluctuating density, but music, I feel, can't really be described in that way because you're really missing the experience of the music and how it affects us, and I think that's really what music is. I don't really think it's describing it in the terms of fluctuating density.
It's kind of two sides of a coin. You could describe heads as being the opposite side of tails, and you could describe the whole world in terms of tails, but there's still a heads on the other side that matters.
Right, exactly.
You were telling me the other day about how astronomers use sound?
Right, we have, I would call it a newer, it's not really a science per se, but all the time we hear the term data visualization. We want ways to visualize the data and get it kind of compact so we can see what's happening in an efficient manner. So sonification is the exact same idea, but turning the data into sound so you can analyze it that way instead of visually. And there are astronomers, her name Wanda Diaz. She has helped develop and worked with sound experts to help develop code to turn data into sound. And she has been reported saying that she feels like there is no difference between the level of astronomy she is able to do now that she's blind than before whenever she could see.
That is pretty remarkable. I think I said it as a joke to you. I was I said something like, "Oh, so you could have a blind astronomer," and you were like, "Oh, well, there actually is a blind astronomer."
Yeah, it turns out.
That's absolutely incredible that we can use sound to open that world.
Right. It's so interesting how she was like, yeah, I just listened to it and it's just like seeing it.
So that's sound, and now we have also music. I like to distinguish music in terms of experiences. So this first type I would describe as non-intrusive music. Do you know what I'm talking about?
How many types are there?
I'm gonna break them down into three categories. But what do you
Okay.
think when I say non-intrusive music?
Non-intrusive music. I would think music maybe that you hear in a movie.
Sure. Yeah.
Like it's in the background, it's setting the tone. If it's like a scary setting, you're gonna have some creepy music or whatever. But you're not really hearing the music. You're kind of watching the show.
Right. It doesn't draw your attention in it, but it enhances the environment in a way. So yes, film scores I think is a great example. Studying music, meditation. Yeah.
Lo-fi hip hop beats.
Yes, the
Super
classic.
popular.
Oh yes. And they're interesting in that they give you something to kind of drown out the background noise, something pleasant to listen to, but it doesn't draw your attention away from what you're actually focused on.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, the second type I like to describe, and this might not be the best name for it, but I refer to it as enhancing. So, when I'm thinking of enhancing, I'm thinking of music that integrates with your experience as opposed to simply being in the background. So I'm thinking of things like exercise music, dancing music. You know what I'm talking about?
So enhancing music. So let me try and wrap my head around this. So music that. Are you actively listening to the music?
I You're not actively listening to it in the way that you would say a classical piece, which is in our third category, but you are kind of drilling into it. Yeah.
Using it as a tool almost.
Right. So with any kind of physical action based on your body and the type of action, there's an ideal frequency there.
Okay. So I'm thinking of, for instance, Taibo. You want to go 1 and 2 and 1 and 2, and music can help you do that.
Yeah, and you want to do it in a certain tempo, actually. So my mom is a Taibo instructor, as you're familiar, but I remember she would always be going through her music catalog and she would adjust the tempo of every single song she had into it so that the tempo was just right.
Oh wow, didn't know that. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I remember she would spend quite a lot of time on one of those really old LimeWire-esque apps getting all the music to the right tempo. But with anything, you have that. So you have sea shanties for doing ship work.
Oh right, they are always singing at some kind of rate and pulling the rope on the certain beats and stuff.
Yeah.
I didn't notice that till just now.
With the military, especially back in the day, you had war drums to get everyone marching in order, or on ships to get everyone rowing in order. And in more modern settings, we also have dancing, be it hip hop breakdancing or two-step with country music.
My mind goes to Dancing with the Stars,
Sure.
because those are always very incredible dancers.
Yeah. So this is music that it's not non-intrusive music like film score music, but it's also not indulgent music, which is what I would call this third category. And this is music that you sit down and you only listen to the music.
Oh, I see. So like going to an opera.
Sure, operatic, and classical music fit here. I think pretty much every genre has some sort of music that can hit in this spot. You have anything from Steve Vai, who we both love, lots of indulgent music for guitar players. If we're thinking rap, or if we're thinking of something like rap, then perhaps I would think Eminem often comes into this category of you can't really listen to it in the background.
Right. He's saying a lot.
You kind of, a lot of times, he has some songs that fit into that category, but I do think he has a lot of songs where you really just gotta listen and pay attention.
Yeah, he is a master of rap. So if you do sit down and listen, there's definitely a lot you can learn.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Do you think this pretty much covers all the musical experiences, or do you have any other ideas about music?
As far as music experience,
Sure, like how you experience music in your day-to-day life.
so I would say that most of the time when I'm listening to music, I kind of just want it in the background.
Yeah. It's that
Uh,
non-intrusive kind of stuff for studying it.
I guess you're quite the opposite, and you indulge in a ton of music because of what you do, really.
Well, what's really funny is because I do so much music for my job, I really don't listen to music for fun at all.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, I would.
So I have a question. So any of these non-intrusive, enhancing, and indulgent,
Mhm.
you would say each of these like are for fun listening to, or for fun? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I would describe pretty much all music experience, quote unquote, for fun, aside from maybe that second category. You can have some things that are strictly not for fun,
Such as.
like the marching drum beat.
Oh, I see.
You,
There's
you
nothing.
can make
Right.
that fun,
You're
but
just
that's not the
order.
purpose. But in general, I think it's for fun.
Okay, that makes sense.
I would say that you're right in that most of my listening fits into the indulgent category because I am sitting there when I am listening to music because I'm listening to it for work. I am sitting there and analyzing every detail of it.
I guess that was mainly my question, so that makes sense.
Yeah. When I exercise, I there's typically music in the background. It's nothing I select, but it'll be there. So I do experience that. And when I play things like D&D, I will have ambient music that I put for the player's benefit. So I do use these musical experiences, but I don't go out of my way to do it as many people might.
Right. You don't really listen to the radio in your car, for instance.
I prefer listening to something like a podcast because my 8 hours a day, I'm pretty much always listening to music.
Right.
So melody and rhythm don't have a difference physically, but here in our experience is where the difference is most profound.
So rhythm, I'm imagining something that happens regularly.
Right, a strong, regular, repeated pattern of movement or sound.
Okay, so that makes sense. So movement or sound. So with the marching band, we have both of those.
You can have rhythms without music. You can have rhythms in nature and with the pure pattern of our speech right now.
Well, I mean, everything is, well, not everything, but there is a lot of things in nature that are regular in nature. Think of like a pump jack, for instance, pulling oil out of the ground. It's just regularly up and down and up and down. It
Yeah.
has a rhythm about it.
So yeah, the pump jack it does have a specific rhythm and it is actually an advantageous rhythm. It's a rhythm that's going at a very specific frequency that allows it to work most effectively.
Oh, right, I see.
And one could imagine one day building an AI or something, building a robot that is capable of enjoying music so that it might drill into these sorts of frequencies to do its specific work.
Oh, I see. Make a robot that uses music to help it get its own rhythm.
Right. That's kind of a sci-fi idea, but it's not an unreasonable idea.
Well, whole topic. So I do know that we have AI currently that you feed like thousands of similar types of song into, and it'll like spit out new songs made of like bits and pieces of the other ones.
Oh yeah.
And it's kind of crazy. Some of these songs sound legitimately like actual songs.
Yeah, I do know what you're talking about, and I've heard the Metallica one, and it's actually really good.
It's kind of mind blowing because, like, how long before we don't have to feed music into it? It just kind of itself learns how to make music just from language.
It's kind of funny. I might be put out of a job by computers before most people.
Well, maybe not. I mean, so this is a little bit off topic, but why not?
Why not?
So chess, if we think about the computers for chess,
Mm-hmm.
no human will ever be as good as a chess computer from now on out.
Sure.
Like from now on, we just our
Yeah.
chess computers are just so far beyond anything we can do. But we still have chess championships and stuff of that sort.
That's true.
even though we'll never compete with those guys.
So there'll always be perhaps a venue for performing artists, but maybe all the music composition will be done by AI in the future.
There's going to be those people who, I'm not listening to it if it wasn't made by a human,
Yeah.
I don't care if it's good or not. It's not natural.
Not natural. That's funny.
Yeah. That's just what I imagine the argument would be.
Yeah. There is a nice things about kind of more natural things. I like the feeling of a book more than the feeling of a tablet.
Oh, right. It's, yeah.
There's that tactile experience that's a little bit different. But to get back, so yeah, there are rhythms in the natural world that aren't necessarily music, but really good musicians can find these rhythms and actually turn them into music.
Rhythms or melodies?
Both. So a melody would be any sequence of notes that are musically satisfying. One could imagine there must be countless amounts of music that is indirectly or directly inspired by birdsong.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Surely somebody has been out there listening to just the bird singing and tried to make a musical piece out of that.
Oh yeah. So
I would be surprised if that hasn't happened.
And you can hear melodies and things like metal hitting metal creates notes. You could find those. Rhythm, I think, is maybe a bit easier. You can find rhythms everywhere.
So melody to me, is that unique to music?
I would say so. I think to be a melody, it has to be musical.
You're trying to create something musical with a melody.
I don't know if the intention has to be there, but the result has to be musical. I think you could accidentally play a melody without trying to.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that makes sense because Steve Vai, for instance, I went to his Vai Academy masterclass a few years back, and he was telling us a story about how he created the melody for Weeping China Doll on his latest album. That's one of the songs.
Yeah.
He said he found this melody when he was outside gardening, and he kind of looked up and noticed that the roses appeared to be a melody on the background picket fence of his. He said it looked like a score, and then the roses kind of looked like notes on the score. And he said he hurried inside, went and got a piece of paper and a pen, came outside, wrote it down, and then out came that song.
It's pretty incredible.
So I guess you could see melody being inspired by, if by roses, then by anything pretty much.
Steve Vai could certainly do that. I think that is a good example of a pure display of ability to recognize pattern that is beyond what most people have.
Right, but he's also like entranced in music all the time, so
right.
Surely he's trying. His brain is just like inadvertently projecting.
Oh yeah, looking for these melodies and rhythms everywhere, put into the world.
Other sciences that music might be related to in particular would be biology, right?
Yeah, there's a big back and forth between biologists and music people. And there's a big argument about whether music is adaptive in terms of biology.
Can you explain adaptive?
So, for a trait to be adaptive, 1, it has to be inheritable, and 2, it has to increase the fitness of the thing that inherits it. So,
and fitness being
the ability
able to reproduce? Correct.
Yeah, to survive and reproduce.
Okay. So survive and reproduce.
Yes.
So the question is music a thing that we send through generation that helps us reproduce?
Right. And you can think of this as either the ability to play music or the enjoyment of music.
Okay. Because clearly we see it all over the place, so it seems like it'd be adaptive.
Right, but not everything we see all over the place is adaptive. For example, junk food.
But I was thinking in terms of other species. We hear, unless I'm just projecting music, for instance, into like the songbirds. They're not necessarily singing, they're just
communicating
to each other, right?
Yeah, it's not clear that birds ever just sing for their own enjoyment like we do.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
It seems to always be some type of communication item.
And what are your thoughts on music as an adaptive trait?
How about first you give me what you think about it? Because there is no right answer to this, only hypotheses.
So I haven't thought about this much, so this will be kind of spur of the moment.
Give me your hot take.
But just right off the bat, I feel like it would be adaptive. Because I feel like it's just been so useful and so helpful for so many things. Surely it's adaptive. That's kind of where my mind goes.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I only recently kind of shifted away from the adaptive camp, but it's certainly very possible that it is.
All right, so convince me otherwise.
So I'm stealing this idea from Steven Pinker. He's a Canadian psychologist who teaches at Harvard. I've listened to a few of his lectures.
I've heard of him. Very smart man.
He calls music auditory cheesecake, in that we have adaptive traits that are the enjoyment of fat and sugar, because it wasn't very long ago that those things were incredibly scarce, and you want to eat as much of it as you can.
Right.
But the desire to eat cheesecake isn't necessarily adaptive. It's kind of a byproduct from other adaptive traits.
Right, we just want the high calorie, low volume of food.
So the idea of music being auditory cheesecake, if we take the analogy, it's the idea that we have these adaptive traits for recognizing different kinds of speech, like ah, ooh, different sounds for communication and for other purposes, like finding prey and running from predators. Additionally, the desire to find the right frequencies for different actions.
Okay.
And music takes these adaptive traits and kind of plays with them in the way that cheesecake plays with our other adaptive traits.
Okay, so my desire to listen to music is similar to my desire to eat cheesecake. I wasn't evolved to desire cheesecake. It just has the right things in it that I kind of like.
Sure.
Music is the same thing. It just has this... It's just a different part of my brain that is just scratching that itch that I like. But there was no music in nature for us to evolve, right? Like, it wasn't out there before us, right?
That's the idea, but I knew this argument before and was still on the other side of the camp not long ago. And what I was thinking was, okay, well, maybe enjoying music isn't adaptive, but perhaps the ability to create music is adaptive. And I thought...
Well, I think that would be a byproduct of just being creative in general.
Perhaps, but I think where the argument fell apart for me was when I paid attention to the other requirement for being adaptive, which is being able to be inherited. And as I thought about it more and looked at examples, I'm not convinced that musical ability is actually inherited.
Is creativity inherited?
Perhaps. I'm not too sure. It seems reasonable to think that, but I'd have to check that to be sure.
I wonder if music ability has to do with or how much of it requires interest.
Yeah.
There might be a ton of potentially excellent musicians out there that just don't have the interest of music.
Yeah, there are certainly traits that make you more likely to be good at doing music. For example, certain face shapes are going to be able to sing a lot better.
Oh, I see. So just straight up, some people have somewhat better voices for singing.
Right, because their head is more resonant or for whatever reason.
Exactly. Right. Okay, that makes sense.
So I'm currently not even convinced that musical ability is even inheritable. You hear people say stuff like that, oh, I come from a big family of musicians and things. But I feel like it seems to be that that's only because of the environment they're raised in, more so.
They were raised around musicians who taught them music, and so, of course.
Because all the time you see people who are musicians and their kids aren't musical or even tone deaf, and then you'll skip a generation and you'll go back to being music. And it just, the more I look at it, the more it seems to me that it's probably just completely independent.
Yeah. So from what I'm getting from it, it sounds like it has a lot to do with interest and creativity, I guess.
That's where my thoughts go, but truthfully, we don't know any of that. It is all just hypotheses. We don't have a theory of musical as a phenomenon in biology.
That's crazy. That is kind of crazy. You would think we'd have something by now.
Nah, it's hotly
I guess
debated.
I guess we do have the theories or the hypotheses that are being debated.
Well, the problem is it's hard to test it because you'd have to go back in time, purge music from the earth, and see what happens.
That does seem kind of hard.
Yeah. But to further Steven Pinker's argument, he would say that he could snap his fingers right now, take all the music from the earth and nothing fundamentally would be missing. You could still go to work. You could still do everything you need to do. I would be out of a job, but...
That's interesting. Well, that just makes me think, like, would we just create more music?
Right. I mean, we might inevitably just recreate. I'm almost certainly would. Just if we got rid of cheesecake, we would certainly... Someone
Just
would make
find
it again.
Yeah.
Yep. But the world wouldn't stop. Society wouldn't collapse. There would be no one who'd really be prevented from doing normal things.
Right. Whereas if you took off our adaptive trait of hunger, for instance.
Yeah, the world would go crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
okay, that makes sense.
It's an interesting idea. So maybe biology isn't the best way to get our fundamental connection between the universe and music, but I think string theory currently holds my best bet.
As a connection between music and the universe? I think...
Yes, even if it's only by analogy.
I think musicians are the best. They're the ones who show us the space of possible sound.
I'd love to tie that together because
Right.
I'm the musician, you're the physicist. I'd actually like to ask you, Tyler, if you could give us all a brief overview of string theory.
Of string theory, okay. So string theory is currently our only quantum mechanical description of gravity.
And when you say quantum mechanical, you're saying how gravity affects very small things?
Right, we don't know how gravity interacts on, like, the atomic scale, for instance. Because we have certain effects like superpositions. If you have a particle in a superposition, like, is the gravity also in a superposition? Like, we're not sure about those kind of answers. So in classical physics, when we think of particles, we tend to think of them, and we even call them point-like particles, meaning that they just exist at a point in space. And a graviton, another one of these particles, it carries the force of gravity. If you treat it as a point-like particle, whenever you have certain interactions between gravitons and other gravitons or other point-like particles, you end up with your equations start exploding off into infinity, or you get nonsensical answers, such as, like, you're dividing by 0. It just doesn't work. And whenever you move the equations around, try and add terms to make it fit, or take away terms that don't make sense, or just do whatever the mathematicians do or the physicists do to make equations work. And whenever you're left with a finally consistent set of equations that all make sense and all work together, only then do you try and interpret what you have. It appears that in order for these interactions to work, instead of thinking of particles as point-like, it seems like we should rather think of them as string-like. Like, the smallest particle is just a small string in space. And each string has a certain vibration to it, or vibrational mode, and that will correspond to the different particles we see.
So when we take classical physics equations, the kind of math we use to determine how a cup moves, and we try applying it to these tiny particles that make up our universe, it doesn't work.
Right, because on the smallest of scales, everything is really just waves, and that's a hard idea to get through.
But if you take the assumption that if you break everything down to the smallest level, we're left with these one-dimensional strings, it makes all the math work?
Pretty much. There's a few caveats. The strings require 10 dimensions. So if we look into the universe, we only see 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, so we have 6 missing dimensions in a sense. With string theory. So there's still some aspects of string theory to be looked at, I'm sure.
Right. It's not perfect, and we haven't discovered everything we need to discover, but the math seems to work.
It's consistent, yes, and we do use bits of math from string theory every day in regular theoretical physics. It's established math.
And based on the frequency these strings vibrate, you get different particles. So one frequency you get an electron, one frequency you get a graviton, so and so. Is that
something
correct?
like that? Yeah.
So I think it's actually a perfect analogy to how music works because these strings are a lot like strings on a stringed instrument, and when they vibrate, they give you a different particle, a graviton or electron, so on and so forth.
Right, exactly.
In music, you get a different note. You get an A, a B, a G, and when you combine all these, you get a universe in real life, but in music, you get a symphony. So, by analogy, one could look at our universe as a symphony coming from these one-dimensional strings.
How would you say it? I think it's a romantic point of view. It does give the universe a bit of flavor to it, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I think, am I right in the analogy kind of holds up? We don't have to make very many changes for that idea to work.
So there is a professor of physics who has worked with string theory, Dr. Ed Copeland. He has several videos you may have seen on Numberphile or 60 Symbols, some YouTube channels. So he's one of the few brave physicists out there who will actually talk about string theory because I guess he's confident in what he knows about it. And he says that the analogy between these fundamental strings and their vibrations corresponding to particles, and then, like you said, stringed instruments and their certain frequencies corresponding to notes. He said that's a pretty exact analogy. So
and with you being in physics and me being in music, between all the different points we've talked over so far, I feel like string theory really has the most poetic connection, I suppose, even if it's not a literal connection. And I think there's a really grandeur to viewing the universe as a symphony of sorts.
Right. You can at least wrap your mind around it. So I guess that gives it a bit of credence.
Yeah. And that concludes our discussion today. Please feel free to ask questions or leave comments about the things we talked about or perhaps didn't talk about in ways that science and music collide in your life.